Good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Priyesh Patel, a medical gastroenterologist. And at the onset, I would start with thanking the team here to give me an opportunity and thanking every one of you for taking out time and joining in this particular topic. A special vote of thanks to Dr. Sachin Wani sir, because of whom probably I am here right now in the conference as well, and probably because of whom I am at Cure as well. That's a different story and elaborate one. So thank you to everyone for joining and taking out the precious times. What we will do is we'll be dividing this particular session into two parts. So lower GI bleeding, where I'll be covering the causes and the best possible endoscopic and the medical management. And after that, Dr. Sachin Wani sir will take it from there and he will cover from the surgical aspect of it. So I'll just try and I'll just assure everyone that it will not be much of a boring talk. Hopefully, it should not be a boring talk. And there are only 20 to 21 slides where I have tried to cover the basic etiologies for lower GI bleeding with some images, pathophysiology, and management of a medical management of a lower GI bleeding. The first we start with the definition, then with the risk stratification, followed by the endoscopic management and the medical management. I think in the next 20 slides, in the next 20 minutes, I should be covering broadly over the causes and the treatment for lower GI bleeding. So my first slide wise, it would be, yes. So just about the definitions of the lower GI bleeding, upper GI bleeding, where does the system start from the upper GI to lower GI? Because right from the mouth to the anal canal, everything is a GI system. So what exactly is the upper GI? What exactly is the lower GI? And I have often seen people having a confusion between what exactly is melena, what exactly is hematochezia, and what is a frank upper GI. So I thought I'll just add two slides about the definition so that things are clear. Okay, what we are looking into from the physician's perspective. Okay, what exactly is the source of bleeding? Because ultimately everything is bleeding inside the lumen will have to come out. So upper GI bleeding is arising from the esophagus, stomach, or the proximal duodenum. The mid-intestinal bleeding arising from the distal duodenum to the ileocecal valve, and the lower GI bleeding arising from the colon, the rectum. So usually the colon on the rectum. There is a large part of a lower GI bleeding is covered by a topic called hemorrhoids, but I am not going to cover it right now because we go something above and over what exactly we know from hemorrhoids or piles or fissures rather than focusing on the same cause right now. As I said, as far as definition is concerned, there are three definitions which everybody is looking for, and stool color and origin and place of bleeding will guide us whether it is an upper GI bleed or a lower GI bleed. First of all, most of the times in a practice, we have a stool routine report where there will be ocal blood which is positive, and the patient will say कि मुझे कोई bleeding नहीं हो रहा है. There is no bleeding from any side at that point of time. So that is what is called as a covert bleeding, not overt. Overt is something which you can see by naked eyes, and covert which is something which cannot be seen by naked eyes. But the stool occult blood will be positive. Usually, this does not really provide any localizing information where the patient is bleeding. Somewhere in the GI system, stool occult blood is positive, but there has to be something. There is a very high possibility of a false positive reports because the patient may be on iron therapy with certain other drugs like aspirin, also with the patient may be mildly bleeding and the stool occult blood may be falsely positive. And what time of the day you do and how many samples you collect, that also depends on the stool occult blood. So it's more of a fallacious test, but it is a good screening marker to know whether exactly the patient is having any form of bleeding, especially when the patient says he is suspecting some bleeding. Otherwise, in finding out from the random samples, it is a difficult test. Yes, stool occult blood has a very good finding in patients with a screening test for somebody who is having a family history of lower GI carcinoma. So carcinoma cecum or carcinoma colon. In that, a stool occult blood test is a very good screening test, and we usually do it once in a year. Apart from that, occult blood testing is not really much of helpful in localizing the cause or the area of the bleeding. Now we come to the next definition, melena. Very commonly used term melena by, sometimes you get a call from the residents, the patient is having melena, or the staff saying the patient was having melena. What exactly is melena? Melena is supposed to be a very dark, tarry. What I tell my patients, them dambar jaisa, them tarry, dambar jaisa, pungently foul smelling stool. It is difficult to evacuate or flush from the commode chair or the pot which the patient is using. Usually, it is suggestive of upper GI origin, but sometimes it can be from the small intestine, proximal to the colon, depending on the origin. Because if it is very slow pace, the patient is having gastroparesis or something like that, then it will come down very slowly. Then still it can be from the lower GI. But usually, if you have melena or upper GI bleeding, then we suspect upper GI bleeding. And the first thing that comes to mind is whether the patient is having something from the esophagus. stomach or up till the duodenum and the ligament of Treats, which divides the duodenum and the jejunum. And the most important would be hematochezia. Hematochezia is basically bright red blood or dark red blood or maroonish colored blood. Usually, it is suggestive of a colonic origin. Very, very rarely, when the transit time is very fast, it can be upper GI, which is very, very unlikely. So if you have melena, then I know that I have to focus more on the upper GI. If I have hematochezia, I know I have to focus more on the lower GI. And if I have covert bleeding, then I know that I have to focus on the entire GI spectrum, and we have to continue with that. So let us focus on the causes of the lower GI bleeding. The most common causes differential diagnosis. So I agree this is more of an age related. Not very young people will not have causes of diverticulosis as number one cause. But since we are not focusing on hemorrhoids and piles and fissures, that's why a patient made diverticulosis as a number one cause of a lower GI bleeding. Angioectasias, hemorrhoids obviously in any age group can be present. Something which is solitary rectal ulcer syndrome, SRUS. I will be describing brief about the solitary rectal ulcer syndrome in a few slides. Colitis, obviously, which can be ischemic bowel disease or infectious disease like tuberculosis, typhoid ulcers, or ischemia. Neoplasm, obviously, a major chunk, especially in the elderly age group, family having a family history of a CA colon, usually they have a high chance of having a neoplasm. Post polypectomy, obviously, gastroenteritis is induced while doing endoscopy and inadvertently cutting and chopping things and causing a bleeding after polypectomy, and diarrhea lesions also. So going through the details of it, so usually the first diverticulosis and the angiectasias along with hemorrhoids would be large volume bleeding, and usually it would be a painless bleeding. Well, the other causes of bleeding like solitary rectal ulcer syndrome or colitis, neoplasm, or post polypectomy will be a small volume bleeding which will be associated with pain, and usually the blood will be mixed with stool. So it will not be frank blood per se, it will be stool mixed with blood. The patient may have it intermittently. One more differentiating part from the history point of view is whether some patient is having intestinal tuberculosis. So usually the patients with intestinal tuberculosis don't really bleed because tuberculosis is something called as end arteries. So most of the arteries are anyway shriveled, so there is no spurter or bleeder usually. And the patient usually presents with weight loss, fever, abdominal pain, even obstruction. And in the intestinal tuberculosis, bleeding comes very, very late. Whereas a carcinomatous causes or obviously colitis related things or infections other than tuberculosis like typhoid will lead to causes of bleeding and lead to causes of pain and diarrhea. So coming to the risk stratification, the first thing which we have to discuss in deciding the OPD setup, okay, whoever has come to me with a lower GI bleeding, he's coming to me, okay, he's saying he's got hematochezia. I have taken the entire history. He is probably or she is probably on ecosprin. I have stopped the ecosprin. Now, how do I decide that what the patient needs to do is upon the predictors of severity of a lower GI bleeding is by risk stratification. So if you have a heart rate of greater than 100, obviously the volume loss is very, very high. If you have a systolic blood pressure of less than 115, patient is having giddiness, syncope. Non-tender abdomen examination, abdomen is absolutely clear. Bleeding during the first 4 hours of evaluation, and significant use of antiplatelets, being aspirin or clopidogrel in these days, or any other anti platelets or comorbid anticoagulants. Any greater than two of these active comorbid conditions is usually a marker that this is a severe lower GI bleed, and this marks for formation of a early rush to the hospital and probably an urgent evaluation by the interventional radiologist. The patient has to be rushed to an emergency care setup for a better practice. The risk factors, zero factors would be about 6% risk. About the factors, just as a maybe the factors is three factors will be 40% risk. And obviously, any factor which is greater than three, there will be 80% chance the patient will have a very high or very severe course. And that is the reason what we would do is, obviously, I would advise to be him to be rushed to the nearest possible emergency medical center. How do we diagnose? The most common bleeding would be to do a full length colonoscopy, which is like the passing the scope entire length from the rectum up till the 10 to 15 centimeters of the terminal area. Usually, a colonoscopy requires a preparation. Obviously, a patient who is actively bleeding will not give much of time for preparation, but still, as far as the guidelines are said, The urgent colonoscopy is something which we can do within 6 to 12 hours of preparation. As soon as the patient lands up, obviously after control of the airway, breathing, circulation, sending the labs for hemoglobin, reserving blood, probably giving blood, securing two large airways, and then putting in a Ryle's tube and giving it almost 5 to 6 liters of a purgative like polyethylene glycol. This is obviously tapered as per patient to patient basis. Somebody who is very old and having systolic heart pressure, or somebody is having cardiac related things, I would obviously not give him so much of volume overload in 1 hour or so. But usually it is recommended so that once the bowl is entirely prepared, that is the time we can see a colonoscopy. However, guidelines also say that in an unprepared bowel also, if there is an active spurter or active bleeder, the chance of picking it up by urgent colonoscopy is to the tune of 75 to 80%. So preparation is one part where we have things in our hand and we can have things in our control. But even in an unprepared colon, things can be very, very easy when we have to obviously take it from there from the history perspective, which exactly area might be the source of bleeding, and a spurter or a bleeder can be controlled at that point of time. How do we control? I'll go into the next slides for sure. So most common causes I mentioned diverticulosis. What exactly is a diverticular? Basically, diverticular acquired herniations of the colonic mucosa. They are usually uninflamed, occur most commonly in the sigmoid colon, and there may be various stages to which the diverticulosis is present. Diverticula may be present for n number of years without the patient having any symptoms whatsoever. The patient may be absolutely asymptomatic, or the patient may have a diverticular disease, which refers to the presence of diverticula associated with symptom, which is the most common symptom is the bleeding, and it occurs in about 20% of individuals with diverticular. How does the etiology go? So diverticular wise, if you can see, this is the colonoscopic image of the diverticula, the normal lumen of the colon. So very difficult to find out which exactly is a normal lumen, which exactly is the diverticular. So these are all many of these diverticulosis is almost like a cavity is a herniation. The colonic mucosa is herniated, and usually if the patient is having a diverticular bleed, then there will be blood at the mouth of the diverticula. It is not very commonly easily seen which diverticula bleeds, and there is staging for the diverticulosis. Dr. Sachin sir will agree with me about the most common classification for diverticulosis bleeding would be Hinch's classification, where stage one was a mild or asymptomatic patients, where patient will be managed by someone like me, and probably grade two onwards, I think I'll be happy to refer it to the surgeons involved, in this case, Vani sir, and happy to do whatever he wants to do, like the surgical aspect of it. But coming to the first part of the medical management, if it is uncomplicated diverticular disease, the therapy is usually to treat the uncomplicated diverticular disease by fiber-rich diets, non-observable antibiotics. There is a role of mesalazine, but you usually don't start it because we do not know the end therapy. And diverticulosis is a acquired condition usually because of chronic constipation over many number of years. So mesalazine, some people use it, some people do not do. But usually fiber-rich diets and somebody who is not well trained enough to pass stools without straining much is more than enough. Contrary to popular belief, there is no such strong evidence that something which is high in seeds or nuts or popcorn can lead to increase in the frequency of complication that seed will get stuck in that. So there is not much of data whether which does it or no. Though we usually tell our patients, all of us data to show us that actually it is a contraindication. First stage management, as I mentioned already, usually to give a KV liquid diet, start him on broad spectrum antibiotic therapy. That's the most important aspect. Most of the diverticular bleeding will settle down on its own if it is grade 1 to grade 2, and only with antibiotic support. Obviously, if it is not stopping and we are doing an endoscopic evaluation, there is something called as hemoclips in this my diagram. So this is a diverticular bleed, and this is the bleeding from the mouth of the diverticula. That's in image A. And in image B and C, what we have done is tried and clipped the mouth of the diverticula by applying perpendicular hemoclips at the mouth so that the bleeding stops. So since this is a outpouching and a herniation and only a vessel which is contained in that particular area, stopping or closing of the mouth of the diverticula will lead to control complete hemostasis, and then there is no need of going back and removing the clips, it stays inside. Obviously, if there are multiple diverticula, there will be chance of bleeding from any other sites also. But usually, a stage 1 diverticular disease is well controlled and well managed by medical management with antibiotics and by the use of hemoclips, which is in this case Mobidenis. Coming to the other etiology, A solitary rectal ulcer syndrome, again, very common in our population these days, in younger people especially. So, very common in males, usually young patients. Somebody who is having a lot of anxiety related issues, they are just fidgeting in the OPD, you will find to know, and having, and probably have been to many other doctors also, have been to doctor shopping kind of a picture, where there is no concrete evidence okay, what exactly is the cause of bleeding. This is usually a chronic condition, it's a benign condition, and obviously, underdiagnosed condition, as I mentioned, कि people go from places to places, and most commonly they have been diagnosed to have hemorrhoids, कि pile से है या fissure से है. But usually it is a ulcer inside the rectum within 10 centimeters from the anal verge, where because it's most commonly because of history of manual evacuation, history of putting the finger inside to remove the hard stools. So whatever time or whatever length the finger goes inside, till that time you will till that area you will find the ulcer. Beyond that, the entire colon is absolutely clear. As I mentioned, usually in anxious individuals, more common in males and in young adults. Clinical features include rectal bleeding, copious mucus discharge, and there is a history of if usually they are not very forthcoming of constipation and incomplete evacuation of stools. And very rarely, when the status has progressed, it may lead to rectal prolapse also. So this is just a diagram. This is the colonoscopic image of a rectal ulcer syndrome and the histopathological findings to see that these are ulcers here. So it can present with anything like a ulcer epithelial erosions. So these are the ulcerations here. Exactly at the rectum. This is just 10 centimeters from the anal verge where the finger can go through. Beyond this, rectum is normal. And even the histopathological examination biopsy wise, there's only a solitary rectal ulcer here, and rest of the colonic mucosa along with the musculus papilla is absolutely normal. Secondly, these ulcers do not cross the area of the lamina propria, so they are not muscularis bound, so they are not usually deep ulcers, and they are only superficial ulcers because that is the usual etiology because of some manual evacuation of fingering that these patients usually have. So coming to the what do you do for a patient with solitary rectal ulcer syndrome? Most important thing is to tell them the patient education that not to strain while passing stools, and irrespective of whatever the urge, because they will always tell you we have to put the fingers inside. You have to train them that unless they stop putting the finger or putting some foreign object inside, this ulcer is not going to improve. That is the most important aspect of treating a solitary rectal ulcer syndrome. Avoid straining or anal digitations. Minimize the time of commute. These days, the patients have a habit of taking the mobile phone inside the washroom or Times of India or Mumbai Mirror or Patani what newspaper, and they are probably deciding about whether India is going to win the war against China or not by sitting on the commode chair, and that is causing more of troubles with the ulcers because of the strains and the pressures. So usually minimizing the time on the commode chair, a high fiber diet with bulk laxatives is usually the treatment. If it is not improved with that, usually there are where we tried with sulfasalazine enemas, so mesalamine enemas or mesalamine foams. Even earlier, what we used to do in our residency is sucralfate enemas. So there was this sucralfate enema did not come in the market. It was not marketed well, I assume. So the conventional proctoplastis enema, we used to empty that from the other end and pour the sucralfate bottle inside and then seal it off and then ask the patient to put the sucralfate enema inside the rectum and keep it there for at least 20 minutes so that there is a healing of the ulcer by way of coating of the ulcer kind of thing. We still do it and I think it really works. But the moment the patient starts putting the fingers again, I think that is the unfortunate thing where it will start coming back. So usually patient education is the prime importance to treating patients with a solitary rectal ulcer syndrome. There is something called as a biofeedback also where we have to start training the patient okay, when to put pressure and when to relax. So it is very common for people not knowing. Usually it is very common in children, but even in adults these days, because of chronic abuse of the fingering and everything, they forget about the whole idea. And then obviously, if it is not settled with that, there are other methods of doing a deficography or transcellular ultrasonography or a rectal manometry also can be done for finding out whether there is any discomfort and dyspnesia, and obviously we can treat it accordingly. Coming to the next pass, this is the most obvious. Probably everybody has heard about this term. So I just thought I'll, sorry for a ghastly images. The images are obviously slightly not very great, but I assume that everybody has dealt with inflammatory bowel disease. So I thought I'll just put the images of inflammatory bowel disease, because inflammatory bowel disease like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's as a cause of lower GI bleed would be a topic where we can talk for hours together. And considering the short time we have 20 minutes, I thought I'll just go through each and every topic in brief rather than going in detail. So IBD, the upper three slides are of ulcerative colitis. You can see the colonoscopic image of superficial ulceration, like the carpet ulcerations all throughout the colon. There is no area of normal mucosa at all. And in the modified image or a magnified image also, there will be ulceration. This is something called pseudopolyps. So the area where the ulcerations has gone down and the normal mucosa looks elevated because of that and gives it as a polypoidal appearance called as a pseudopolyps. This is a classical ulcerative colitis or pancolitis. And here we have images of a Crohn's colitis where there will be patchy distribution. Compare this with this. So you have a pseudopolyps here and ulcerations in this side, but rest of the intervening mucosa will be normal. In here, the rest of the intervening mucosa will be absolutely abnormal. The ulcerations all throughout. I think this would be a better image. There's an ulcer here, there's an ulcer here, the arrow showing ulcers, and this is the normal intervening mucosa, which differentiates a ulcerative colitis from a Crohn's colitis, where in ulcerative colitis, the entire mucosa will be there. Sorry, I hope I'm audible. There's some meeting here. So I'll not take much of time. I think I'll be taking much of time now. I'll be fine. Next 5 minutes, I'll conclude. So ulcerative colitis would be the entire carpet area will be involved, and the Crohn's disease, there will be patchy ulcerations. So there will be patchy ulcerations. Just to give a brief care, how exactly when you do endoscopy, what we look inside for, and what gives us a differential diagnosis on a colonoscopy, and how is a colonoscopy helpful in finding out a cause of a lower GIT. Coming to the description, this is the endoscopy last we did of a patient with this, the rectal, this is the rectum with this, the scope is inverted, the ileocecal area, the transverse colon, and then this is the cecal area, and these are the pseudopolyp areas, and this is only involved in the patchy part, and these are the ulcerations, more of transverse ulcerations all throughout. This gentleman was found to have Crohn's disease, and we treated him with the conventional therapy, and now he's much better. So treatment of IBD, just in brief. So most important for ulcerative colitis would be 5-ASA, that is mesalamine, which can be in form of oral medicines or granules or suppositories, enemas and foams. So entire spectrum, depending on which area we need to treat, we can have options in the form of tablets, say suppositories, say foams and enemas. Steroids in severe cases or in acute inflammations, obviously to bring down the inflammation. Only in mesalamine does not work in cases where the severity is moderate to severe. In mild cases, mesalamine works very well. Initial antibiotic cover just to rule out any secondary infections. Some people use probiotics, but there is no data as far as the ECO guidelines is concerned. There is no significant data about the use of probiotics in the treatment of IBD. And obviously, if it is not covered by conventional combination of a steroid and a 5-ASA, then we go for other medications in the form of anti-TNF agents like infliximab or adalimumab, but those are beyond the reach of this particular time agenda. Something what we can do endoscopically to clear the bleeding. Obviously, something called as argon plasma coagulation. Where does it work? So it does not really work in cases of Crohn's or ulcerative colitis or in case of diverticular also, but it definitely works in cases of a small ulcer, maybe NSAID ulcers, or it works in cases where ecospleen or clopulate is the cause of ulcer in a particular colonic epithelium, or it works in cases where there would be some about superficial ulcerations and showing some active bleeding or colopathy, where an argon plasma coagulation will work. So along with the endoscope, we pass in a scope, we pass in a probe, and that this is the wire, the probe wire. One part is connected to the channel and one part goes inside the channel. The principle is that it is usually a high frequency monopolar current. So from that electrode, there will be argon flow in the probe here. So argon gas is connected, and there will be this electrode from which argon gas passes through the coagulation probe and the electrode at its tip. And when we press the foot switch, it activates the electrode. The electrons will flow through the channel electrically and get activated. And by heat coagulation, there will be coagulation of the mucosa. So it is the safest possible way to prevent a bleeding cases of actively bleeding smaller ulcers or in angiectasias where there is a bleeding from a small vessel, or even post polypectomy also, or even in cases where there is NSAID induced ulcers. The best benefit of this argan plasma coagulation is that if you see the coagulation is only superficial, so there is no way that there is damage to the deeper tissues. So our main concern is that the bleeding should stop without damage to the deeper tissues. So once the gas flows to the small blue probe, and once we have the foot switch here, when we press it, with the passage of electric currents, there will be heat wave coagulation, and with that, the tissue surface will singe and the bleeding would stop. Very commonly used in upper GI bleeding also in cases where there is gave gastric enterocolitis ectasia, and in cases of PHG also, lower GI bleeding, I mentioned angiectasia would be the most common cause where we are using iron plasma coagulation. And my one of my last slides. So this is just to give you an example of angiectasia. See multiple areas of bleeding, and this is after applying of the probe. See multiple areas of bleeding here, where will be small oozing from all areas. No amount of adrenal injection helps here. So argan plasma coagulation is the area where we do a lot of APC. So after the pre APC, and once we start doing the APC and we do multiple areas, wherever we see blood, we usually do it. The probe is supposed to be not touching the colonic mucosa, so there is no chance of perforation or bleeding at all, and the probe just stays in this at a certain distance from the mucosa. And with heat wave, there is coagulation effect, and there will be complete stoppage of the bleeding. Depending on the area of involvement, it can be done in multiple setups. And obviously, the primary treatment would be to treat the cause in cases of argan plasma coagulation. And last two slides about how do we manage. So algorithm for evaluation of patient with hematochezia. Assess the activity of the bleeding, whether it is active or it is inactive. When we are not sure, the best way to put is to put a nasogastric lavage. If it is positive, when there is active aspirate from the nasogastric lavage, the patient goes for upper GI endoscopy. Mind well, this is positive only in 40% of patients. 60% of patients do not have any active bleeding through the NG, even if they have active bleeding in the stomach. So this is more of an obsolete method, but just in case if you have to decide if you have less of time and what procedure needs to be done first, maybe an NG can help in the first 40% of cases. It is inactive, then we have to prepare for colonoscopy for sure and start doing it. Hemodynamic instability would be the first area of looking at it. Active GI bleeding, even if colonoscopy, we have endoscopically, sometimes endoscopically the cause is not found out. A good surgical backup and probably a radiographic and treating the cause or finding out the cause of the GI bleeding. But I would always like to have a surgical backup ready. And if I cannot do it endoscopically, and it's obviously there are so many other causes of a lower GI bleeding, which we'll be covering in the next slide and next chapter by Dr. Vani sir. And I think he'll be throwing some light to it. So this was in brief just about the cause of upper GI bleeding, and hope I have not exceeded my 20 minutes, and cause of lower GI bleeding and the management for the lower GI bleeding. And I once again thank everyone for being a patient audience, and obviously most importantly, thank you Vani sir for giving me the opportunity. And I, as you already said, that I am here because in this conference because of you, and probably I am here at QA also because of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Priyesh. Nice topic, nice lecture to start with. Makes my job easy.
You've been kind with words. Thank you. I just mute myself now.
So Dr. Priyesh is a full visiting gastroenterologist at QA Hospital. So he gives me support for all my endoscopies at QA Wagwe Hospital. We both work as a team here, and so we have all facilities under one roof. That's the advantage.